I guess some would say more in line
I
with everyone
didn't
else around them.
I didn't exactly mean like those smaller parts. Like if you have like a smaller part like drinking unpasteurized milk, that and if they do not accept, then we bring in force. But we should not bring in force as our first weapon.
Why?
If bringing in force is our first weapon, this can grow distrust, which is also why certain revolutions could happen.
I don't think like a minority that has that much level of power to like cause some kind of revolution. However, I do feel like given the fact that they're coming into like a new place to live, like you wouldn't go to someone else's house and just like put your feet up on the table and just make yourselves at home. It just seems to be the case that it would be beneficial for all parties involved for people to accept the fact that there's differences within their cultures, and there should be like a way in which they'd be expected to behave and fall in line with certain like cultural norms and stuff and whatnot.
I guess the question that's at stake is what is meant by the phrasing of conform.
Right. And so that's why I brought up this idea of I used specifically assimilation practices on indigenous people as an example because it's aligned with colonization for us to appoint like these states and these nations. And so looking at the practices specifically that have been done towards indigenous people is a way that we can look at practices that are assimilatory. So yes, it is a little different than what we would see with like immigration, but when we talk about like how we would enforce, like what would be the mechanisms behind enforcing conforming, we can't just say, oh, well, you should be expected to speak English if you come to America. No, there needs to be more than just a social like idea of, well, this is a belief. That's why I'm thinking when we're talking about conforming, there has to be policy behind it. There has to be some kind of mechanism of action. It can't just be, oh, well, this is the generalized consensus. Like that's why I use the examples of the indigenous people, because that's our largest, as far as I know, that's our largest amount of research in forced assimilation is what's done to those people. So I guess that would be the question is, to what extent do we want to talk about conforming? Do we want to say that they must be like, is it an enforced Christianization? Is it forcing them to speak English if they're in an English speaking language predominantly? To what extent are we expecting this assimilation to happen? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
and with the question, it's sort of what I was sort of struck by was it was conforming to social norms, not conforming to the laws of the country. I think there's a big difference between like something being illegal in one country versus like a socially accepted norm. So the impetus that an immigrant should come in and conform to social practices versus legal practices is different, in my opinion.
Exactly.
So the child rape thing is not quite analogous.
Right. The female genital mutilation, like that's not legal in the United States. So you would be punished for that. Whereas if they're telling you, oh, well, you can't put hawash in your vegetables because that's not an American practice, which hawash is just an African herb. But see that, what is that? Like, is it going against norms or is it going against legal guidelines? Like we don't allow, well, actually we do have child marriage in America, so I can't say that, but we don't allow certain practices that we consider legally deviant, but there is deviance in practical aspects. Like, for example, a lot of immigrants that tend to come to America.
So what if I take the position of civic nationalism? So creating like a national identity that's not based upon some kind of like arbitrary, so like your ethnic like background or your racial background, but it forms like a cultural identity based upon shared like values and norms, right? I would say that there's benefit and like utility in that.